Good evening. In 1989, after a near-death car accident in the United States that left me depressed, I was diagnosed by specialists with post-traumatic stress disorder. The near-death experience simply brought back suppressed memories of similar experiences during the Lebanese Civil War. I can speak of 2 near-death experiences and countless other life-threatening experiences from the 12 years that I lived through the war. At the time, specialists advised that the way to address this newly triggered trauma was to revisit the past, which I did in my own way, and it proved to be therapeutic to a certain extent. However, I am not sure if the scars of the war have been completely healed in me. The 15 years of civil war ended abruptly in 1990, and people were expected to return to life as usual, as if nothing happened, just as we did a few months ago. But what about what happened? What about the emotional and psychological scars to what happened? What about the national vertical division that resulted from what happened? What about the paranoia, distrust, and phobia that have been cultivated toward the other, the different, because of what happened? Should we dig into the past and revisit it? Or should we simply bury it, keeping it hidden under the carpet? And do we have the determination to be healed from these ailments that befell us because of what happened? The archaeology of violence, the digging out of violence, historiography as a tool for peace after Lebanon's war, is an attempt to address these and many other questions. We are pleased and honored this evening to have with us Mrs. Shadin Hani to speak about this topic to us. Mrs. Hani is the co-founder of the Action Research Associates, which is an organization that is established with Dr. Martin Akkad, who's the president of the Near East School of Theology, in the year 2000. She is currently completing her PhD dissertation as part of a joint program between the International Baptist Theological Seminary and Free University of Amsterdam. The title of her dissertation is Historiography and Transitional Justice, Lebanon as a Case Study. She is interested in showing how a multiple narrative approach to competing historical accounts of the past can lead to a peaceful living. After Mrs. Hani's lecture, we will watch a video featuring multiple narratives of an event from the Civil War that will be followed by a conversation led by President Akkad with you. On behalf of the Near East School of Theology, I welcome you all to this series of public lectures. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mrs. Shadin Hani The floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Awad, for this generous introduction. I'm sure you all read the title of this lecture, Archaeology of Violence, Historiography as a Tool for Peace After Lebanon's War. Now, some of my friends shared that they had to use ChatGPT to understand the meaning of the title. But it's only the title which is a bit complicated. The content is simpler, I promise. It's just about dealing with the past, with memory, with war, historiography, and theology. It's very simple and straightforward. So, let's start. History, as we know, as we heard, famously by Sir Winston Churchill, is written by the victors, which is only true. But in Lebanon, where the civil war that lasted 15 years from 1975 until 1990, as Dr. Awad reminded us, ended without a clear winner and was swept away with the famous statement, "Let bygones be bygones." In Lebanon, we faced a different reality, one where history remains unwritten, absent from our curricula, and unexamined in public discourse. Without a shared historical record, we are left without the tool to understand what happened, to reconcile with the past, as Dr. Awad said, or to heal as a society. This absence not only hinders our ability to build a future based on truth and accountability, but also denies new generations the opportunity to learn from the devastating outcomes of the civil war. So if we are to move forward as a nation, we should deal with our past and cultivate a collective memory that enables us to work together for the common good. But as we strive to construct a shared historical record, we must ask, whose voices shape this narrative and whose are excluded? Can history truly be written in the present, or is it always a reconstruction of the past through contemporary lenses? Nearly 3.5 decades after the war's end, since 1990, historiography is not merely a means of engaging with the past, but the only way to critically interpret, contest, and navigate its narratives. What is historiography? Sorry, I have to. Historiography, by definition, is about understanding how history is written, who writes it, and the forces that shape its production. It is a critical reflection on the methodologies, epistemologies, and frameworks historians use to interpret and construct narratives. Far from being a neutral recounting of events, historiography is a battleground where power, memory, and meaning collide. As historian and literary theorist Hayden White argues, quote, "History is not merely a collection of facts, but a framework that determines what we remember, what we forget, and how we shape our collective identity," end quote. In post-conflict settings, this approach is a double-edged sword, either reinforcing division or illuminating ways toward reconciliation. In this presentation, we will meet some figures here. We will explore a historiographical approach that integrates Hayden White's theory of tropes. Tropes, I will explain in a few minutes what tropes mean, with Chantal Mouffet's concept of agonistic pluralism. This framework offers a critical lens for engaging with contested histories, particularly as we have in Lebanon, where multiple, often conflicting narratives shape collective memory and identity. We begin by examining White's theory of tropes, which highlights how historical narratives are not neutral but are constructed through rhetorical and literary modes. Next, we turn to Mouffet's theory of agonistic pluralism, which advocates for engaging with competing narratives as a means of fostering democratic discourse rather than suppressing differences. A theological dimension is then introduced, demonstrating how religious and ethical perspectives contribute to historical interpretation and can play a significant role in peacebuilding. Finally, as Dr. Awad shared, the lecture concludes with a case study presented by Dr. Martin Aqad on a multiple narratives approach to an event from the Lebanese Civil War. This practical illustration showcases how embracing multiple narratives can transform sources of antagonism into platforms for constructive engagement, ultimately fostering a more inclusive and reflective understanding of the past. Now I begin. That was only the introduction, sorry. So, prominent postmodern scholar Hayden White has significantly shaped our understanding of historiography. White challenges the notion of history as an objective recounting of facts. Instead, he emphasizes that historical narratives are inherently shaped by the historian's choice. In his seminal work, Metahistory, written in 1973, White asserts that historians, much like literary authors, employ specific narrative structure, modes of emplotment, and ideological perspectives to craft coherent accounts of the past. Emplotment means a concept that describes the way historians shape historical events into meaningful narratives, to explain the term. For White, history is not a simple retrieval of facts, but, quote, a verbal structure in the form of narrative prose discourse, end quote, which he means it as a combination of data, theoretical concepts for explaining these data, and a narrative structure for their presentation, altogether as an icon of sets of events presumed to have occurred in times past. In the same line, Susan Buckley, a scholar in transitional justice and memory studies, defines narrative structure as a subjective representation of reality, shaped by the cultural, social, and political context in which they are produced. While philosopher and historian Avizier Tucker highlights that narratives in historical writing are not mere recollection of events, but are imbued with interpretation, thus shaping how the past is understood. Both and other definitions reflect the agency of the historian and his interpretive skills in the reconstruction of history. Moreover, in a study on competing historical narratives, historian William Cronon frames his inquiry around the challenge posed by bias in historical narratives. He notes that while, quote, historians may strive to be fair as they can, it remains possible to narrate the same evidence in radically different ways, end quote, implying that no single narrative holds inherent superiority over another in terms of how people experience or understand the past. This aligns with White's view that events are not simply found in the historical record. They are actively created by historians through their narrative and linguistic choices, making historical narratives provisional and open to reinterpretation. Let us take a closer look at White's theory of tropes or narrative constructions. In his theoretical framework, White introduces the concept of tropes, which are, the meaning of tropes, types of narrative structures that historians use to shape their accounts. He categorizes those tropes into 4 modes of emplotment. As I explained, emplotment describes the way historians shape historical events into meaningful narratives. These 4 modes of emplotment are romance, tragedy, comedy, and satire, each reflecting distinct philosophical perspective. For instance, romance portrays heroism and liberation, emphasizing triumph over adversity. I think you can read them here. Tragedy highlights human limitation and societal divisions, offering a reflective lens on conflict. Comedy introduces hope and reconciliation, often resolving tensions in a celebratory way. Satire employs irony to critique human consciousness and ideologies. These tropes not only provide a structure for historical narratives, but also reveal the historian's interpretive choices and ideological underpinnings. White's theory of tropes provides a nuanced framework for interpreting historical narratives, particularly in post-conflict societies as Lebanon. Among these tropes, the tragic mode is instrumental in narrating events, as in Lebanon, since it fosters empathy by acknowledging the limitations and vulnerabilities of the parties involved. While the comic mode, which is here, introduces hope, portraying history as a process in which struggles can be overcome, even if only partially or temporarily. White further expands this framework by proposing a hybrid mode of tropes, like a combination of the tropes that he mentioned: romance, tragedy, comedy, tragedy, romance, satire. But in the context of Lebanon, the tragicomic mode emerges as particularly relevant as it captures the dual reality of historical experience, the tragedy of human suffering and the comedic potential for reconciliation. Comedy not as in jokes, but comedy as the outcome, a positive outcome. This approach is especially significant in post-conflict settings. By integrating elements of both tragedy and comedy, the tragicomic mode frames reconciliation as a central theme. Both consider reconciliation as central. While the tragic aspect forces societies to confront the painful realities of conflict, the comic element introduces the possibility of overcoming divisions. For White, the interplay between tragedy and comedy reflects a deeper philosophical progression. By incorporating both elements, historians are able to assimilate the truth of human existence. Tragedy capturing suffering and struggle, and comedy envisioning the potential for resolution. This process aligns with a broader historical movement toward redemption, wherein humanity strives to overcome the constraints of experience. The shift from tragedy to comedy in historical narratives, therefore, represents not just an optimistic resolution, but an evolving consciousness, one that embraces the fragmentary and imperfect nature of any singular understanding of reality. However, White's relativistic approach to historiography has not been without criticism. Scholars, such as Keith Jenkins and others, argue that an emphasis on narrative construction risks undermining historical accuracy, particularly in post-conflict societies like Lebanon, where establishing factual truth is essential for justice and reconciliation. We have to have facts in order to have justice. The concern is that if history is viewed primarily as a literary or rhetorical exercise, it may open the door for oppressive regimes to manipulate the past to serve their own agendas. Yet, proponents of postmodern historiography counter that multiple narratives do not reject the truth, but rather expand its scope, offering a means to uncover deeper historical realities by including diverse perspectives and validating marginalized voices. It is within this tension between historical accuracy and narrative plurality and the complexity of the political context of Lebanon that Chantal Mouffet's theory of agonistic pluralism provides a valuable framework. By reframing conflicting groups as adversary rather than enemies, Mouffet's approach encourages engagement through respectful disagreement. How? Mouffet distinguishes between antagonism, where opposing groups view each other as enemies, and agonism, which redefines them as adversaries engaged in respectful disagreement. This distinction is particularly significant for societies with deeply contested histories, as it enables conflicting narratives to coexist without imposing a singular unified truth. According to Mouffet, reconciliation does not require consensus, but rather the creation of a political space where opposing perspectives engage within democratic processes. Recognizing that politics is inherently conflictual, her model emphasizes managing differences through mutual recognition and respect rather than striving for uniformity. Agonistic relationships legitimizes adversaries, ensuring that political contestation is structured around engagement rather than enmity. By shifting the focus from mutual hostility to adversarial respect, agonistic pluralism reframes contested memories as opportunities for dialogue rather than sources of division. After all, in a healthy democracy, conflicts do not vanish. They are redirected into structured debates that allow differing perspectives to be acknowledged and negotiated, right? In this sense, both White's narrative theory and Mouffet's agonistic pluralism converge on a shared principle. Historiography must be inclusive of multiple perspectives. White's emphasis on narrative multiplicity highlights the need to represent the diverse experiences of communities affected by conflict, while Mouffet's framework provides a model for engaging with these narratives constructively. Together, they offer a historiographical approach that does not seek to erase tension, but rather channels them into a process of engagement, ultimately fostering dialogue and reconciliation. But if history, as Hayden White argues, is an interpretive act shaped by narrative choice, ideology, and language, then the question arises: how do different traditions infuse history with meaning? How do different traditions infuse history with meaning? While White highlights the role of the historian in shaping historical understanding, theological historiography extends this process beyond a human agency, situating history within a broader, often divine framework. Here, historical events are not only subject to interpretation, but are also understood through the lens of divine purpose and moral significance. This shift does not reject the constructed nature of historical narratives, but rather reframes them within a theological vision that seeks coherence, redemption, and ultimate meaning. In this sense, theological historiography does not merely recount the past, it interprets history as part of a larger providential design, what that continues to shape belief, identity, and collective memory. This dynamic interplay between history, interpretation, and meaning is central to theological historiography. As theologian James Cone observed, the past is not a fixed thing, but a dynamic interaction between memory and interpretation. His insight underscores the evolving nature of historical narratives, reminding us that divine truth is not merely a static inheritance from the past, but a living, unfolding reality shaped by culture, theology, and historical experience. This perspective becomes even more pressing in an age shaped by postmodern thought, where objectivity is questioned and grand narratives are deconstructed. As traditional notions of historical truth give way to more interpretive frameworks, the study of theology in history faces a unique challenge. How can modern interpreters remain faithful to the theological insights of the past while navigating the fragmented, pluralistic realities of the present? How can modern interpreters remain faithful to the theological insights of the past while navigating the fragmented, pluralistic realities of the present. Theological historiography is the answer, because it offers an important lens through which we can approach this question, inviting us to critically examine how sacred histories have been written, transmitted, and reinterpreted across time. Traditionally, theological historiography presented biblical history as a linear, divinely ordained narrative. However, postmodern critiques reveal these histories as dynamic constructions shaped by their cultural, historical, and theological contexts. Today, together we will explore how postmodern theories, particularly those of Hayden White and John Caputo, could help us reimagine theological historiography, challenging traditional assumptions while embracing multiplicity and complexity. Interesting, no? So, historically, biblical historiography emphasized divine omnipotence, linear progression, and a single unified narrative, as seen in Eusebius of Caesarea's ecclesiastical history, which portrays the church's history as evidence of God's providence. This providential linear view shaped Christian thoughts for centuries. However, the rise of postmodernism challenges these assumptions, critiquing absolutism and objectivism while embracing interpretive diversity, moral ambiguity, and the influence of cultural contexts. So, a little bit, I don't want to bore you, so I will move to give you some examples of what I'm saying. For example, the New Testament blends theology and history, particularly in the Gospels, which are often viewed as both Greco-Roman biographies and Hellenistic historiographies. Acts also situates Christian history within a divine framework, presenting events as part of God's unfolding plan. Similarly, Paul's epistles interpret history theologically, such as in Galatians 3:28, where he emphasizes God's intentions to unite Jews and Gentiles within a new covenant. This fusion of historical narration with theological meaning reflects the broader role of theological historiography in shaping how the past is understood. Kevin Van Hooser, a biblical scholar, builds on this, suggesting that biblical narratives, like Jesus' parable, for example, invites multiple interpretation, whether as tales of divine forgiveness, critiques of self-righteousness, or reflections on family dynamics. Likewise, theologian John Van Setters, in his prologue to history, shows how Genesis creation, for example, creation narratives reflects diverse theological interpretation and cultural contexts. In Genesis 1 presents a structured 7-day creation narrative, emphasizing order, divine sovereignty, and cosmic harmony, likely influenced by the priestly tradition during the Babylonian exile. In contrast, Genesis 2 offers a more anthropocentric and intimate depiction of creation, rooted in earlier Yahwist traditions. These narratives, as Van Setter notes, are woven together, not as a cohesive historical timeline, but as reflections of diverse traditions that address different theological and communal needs. Similarly, theologian Hans Balthasar adds another layer, showing how theological diversity enriches our understandings. In his analysis of the crucifixion, Balthasar invites readers to explore it not merely as an event of human suffering, but as a profound mystery of divine love, justice, and redemption. He highlights how different theological traditions emphasize various aspects of this event. The Eastern Orthodox focus on Christus Victor, Christ's triumph over death and sin. The Roman Catholic emphasis on atonement, and Protestant reflections on grace and faith. For Balthasar, these diverse interpretations are not contradictory, but complementary, revealing the multifaceted nature of God's salvific plan. This diversity of theological narratives, as seen in the works of Vanseter and Balthasar, highlights an essential truth. Theological history is not a monolithic account, but a dynamic interplay of perspectives. Each tradition, whether emphasizing triumph, atonement, or grace, shapes our understanding of divine action in history. But how do we engage with these multiple narratives, the question is? How we determine what is historical, what is theological, and what is shaped by the needs of its interpreters. These questions lie at the heart of both historiography and theology. And in the postmodern era, two key tools, which are deconstruction and situatedness, can help us understand how meaning is actively produced within historical and theological frameworks. French philosopher, whose name is complicated for me, his name is Jean Baudrillard, pushes this idea further when he asks, I'm here. I think two back. This here? One more back. Yeah. So, French philosopher, yes, whose name is Jean Baudrillard, pushes this idea further when he asks, the question is not whether the text is a reflection of the world, but whether the world is a reflection of the text. In other words, our historical and theological interpretations do not merely document reality, they shape how we understand it. This shift forces us to reconsider, how do the stories we tell influence what we accept as truth? The first of these tools, as I said, deconstruction and situatedness, the first one is deconstruction, introduced by Jacques Derrida, allows us to expose the hidden structures within texts, revealing contradictions, power dynamics, and the instability of meaning. Deconstruction challenges dominant narratives, asking us to recognize that what we take as truth is often the result of selective interpretation and exclusion. When applied to historiography and theology, deconstruction pushes us to move beyond fixed reading of the past. I will demonstrate with an example taken from John Caputo, who develops this idea in his book, The Weakness of God, where he challenges traditional views of divine power by presenting a weak theology inspired by 1 Corinthians. Yeah. 1 Corinthians 1:25, which speaks of God's weakness as being stronger than human strength. The verse says, "For the foolishness of God is wiser than man, and the weakness of God is stronger than man." Rather than emphasizing control or domination, Caputo reinterprets divine power as relational and self-emptying. This challenges classical notions of omnipotence, instead portraying a God whose true strength lies in vulnerability and openness. Through the lens of deconstruction, Caputo's weak theology suggests that God's presence is not a coercive force, but an event, one that unfolds in unexpected and relational ways, offering a radically different perspective on the divine. The Genesis creation stories also offer a place for deconstructive reading. The first creation narrative in Genesis 1 until 24, presents God as an orderly creator who brings the world into being through a series of planned acts, reflecting themes of providence and beauty. In contrast, the second creation narrative in Genesis 2:4-24 portrays a more intimate, anthropomorphic, human-like God who creates humans out of the earth and establishes moral responsibility. By looking at their differences, we see these accounts as a reflection of different historical and theological contexts, rather than as a unified singular truth. At the same time, situatedness reminds us that every interpretation is shaped by its historical, cultural, and ideological context. No historian or theologian operates from a neutral position. Our perspectives are informed by our backgrounds, experiences, and intellectual traditions. Acknowledging this situatedness does not mean abandoning the search for meaning, but rather engaging with it critically and reflexively. For example, the Exodus narrative in the Hebrew Bible reflects the experiences of a people struggling for freedom from oppression. Walter Brueggemann's analysis of this narrative, a theologian, Walter Brueggemann's analysis of this narrative demonstrates how the story of Israel's liberation is not simply an account of historical events, but a theological statement about the power of God to intervene in human history. For the exiled Israelites, the retelling of the Exodus story was an act of identity formation and resistance, reinforcing their hope in God's promises. In this way, the story becomes a tool for theological reflection in the context of exile and suffering. Therefore, to wrap up these two tools, by employing deconstruction and situatedness, we move beyond rigid, singular narratives and open up spaces for dialogue, reinterpretation, and inclusivity in both history and theology. These tools not only deepen our understanding, but also equip us to navigate the complexities of historical and theological discourse in a more thoughtful and responsible way. Way ahead, a prescriptive multiple narrative approach for reconciliation. As we look ahead, I propose a prescriptive approach to historiography that draws from the rich insights of biblical scholarships and theological thought. This approach seeks not merely to describe the multiplicity of narratives within contested histories, but to actively prescribe a framework for engaging these narratives as a pathway towards reconciliation and ethic responsibility. In the works of biblical scholars, we find a fresh understanding of history as inherently polyphonic, multiple narrative. The diversity of perspectives within Scripture, reflective of differing contexts, author, and theological agendas, serves as a model for navigating the complex and contested narratives of Lebanon's history. However, rather than viewing this multiplicity descriptively as merely reflecting the irreconcilability of divergent experiences, I advocate for a prescriptive approach which frames the multiple narratives approach as an active process for engaging conflicting perspectives, emphasizing that these voices are not obstacles to reconciliation, but rather opportunities for creating spaces of agonistic dialogue. In reimagining theological historiography through this prescriptive lens, we move beyond mere acknowledgement of historical plurality toward an active engagement with contested narratives as sites of ethical and theological responsibility. This approach does not simply tolerate difference, it embraces it as a necessary condition for reconciliation, fostering a historiography that is both truthful and transformative. So, as we integrate theological insights with historiographical methods, we envision history as a space where divine justice and human agency intersect, calling communities to a deeper reckoning with their past in pursuit of a just and inclusive future. In the Lebanese context, this means rejecting triumphalist or exclusionary narratives that perpetuate divisions and instead embracing an approach that remains open to the multiplicity of meaning and the ongoing event of reconciliation. In the words of the Apostle Paul, all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. This ministry challenges us to construct narratives that do not merely recount division, but actively pave the way for healing, justice, and a shared vision of peace. Thank you, and I apologize if I bored you. Now, thank you. And now we move to the fun part with Dr. Martin Akkad.
It's great to be able to give you the boring part, Shadon. That was rich, thank you very much. The archaeology of violence. Why archaeology? Why not the overall view? Why not a meta-narrative? Meta-narratives are interesting. Imagine yourself on a site in Byblos, or in Sur in Tyre in the south, or in downtown Beirut before they dumped everything into the sea. And you know that there is a city there. And you really would like to describe that city, but you know that you can only arrive to it by digging gradually. And so archaeology is about not selling out the detail, not selling out the tree for the forest, and actually being interested in the detail, in digging out. So for the past 4 years, Shadon, my colleague, and another colleague called Tim, who currently lives in Belgium, we spent a good amount of time digging up narratives as archaeologists of memory. We're going to show you one of our modules, and it's about what is known as the infamous Damour massacre. It's a painful event in January of 1976, so a few months after the start of the Lebanese Civil War. When you, so I don't think there are under 18s among us, that's good. I haven't shown that to my children who are under 18 because it can be painful, so if you're sensitive to these sorts of things, I hope this will not be too harmful. As you watch the film, it's a visual representation of two distinct narratives that we have dug out from history. As you watch them, don't try to reconcile, don't argue with what you see. Don't say, no, you know, I've seen, I know a different story from that. Allow the two narratives to speak to you, to reveal themselves. This is why we call it archaeology. And so the artifact gradually appears, and you put it in all of its beauty, ugliness, roughness, polishness in a location. Then you dig out some more and you find another artifact and you put it next to it. And the hope is that with time, the various modules which are digging out various moments of the Civil War will come to form the story of the Lebanese wars, our history. That's the idea of multiple narrativity. So we did not apply criticism to the narratives as they came out. We did not judge them. We allowed them to be. And we used three types of sources to dig up the narratives. First, we used archival research. We went to newspapers, daily newspapers of around that time. And that's one source. We began to collect together the story, the narrative, from different perspectives. Then we interviewed victims, perpetrators, sometimes people who would qualify as criminals, and witnesses. And then we brought those testimonies and put them next to the archival narratives and further shaped the narratives. Gradually, two distinct narratives began to emerge. There were more nuances. They can be found in the footnotes of the narratives. They weren't distinctive enough to warrant a distinct narrative. Then we did the third step, which was very important, which is to verify the narratives. Because we're not interested to impose our own view or judgment on the narrative. We want the narratives to reflect a collective memory. So we went to top leaders who would be considered the heirs of particular collective memories, representing those narratives. And we presented them with our narrative, and our question was, does this reflect the way you tell the Damour massacre? What would you add? What would you remove? What would you alter? And we accepted those comments and remarks, and we further shaped the two narratives. So we ended up with two distinct narratives, because the purpose, as Shadon has said, is to be intentional, so prescriptive is the way you've called it, in the way we use the narratives, even though the narratives themselves are descriptive and we are putting together what we hear. Enough talking. We're going to watch the video. It's 12 minutes and a half. Maybe we can dim the light here. And after those 12 minutes and a half, I'm going to come up here and ask you a few questions and moderate a brief conversation about what we see.
مع بداية ال76 كانت الدامور هالبلدة المسيحية بموقعها الاستراتيجي على الطريق الساحلي يلي بيربط بيروت بالمخيمات الفلسطينية بالجنوب، محل ما تمركزت الميليشيات الفلسطينية لتقوم بعملياتها العسكرية ضد إسرائيل. بالتالي كان يعتبر هالطريق الساحلي معبر أساسي لنقل الأسلحة والمؤن بين بيروت والجنوب، وكان في حاجز للجيش اللبناني وحواجز تاني طيارة لأهالي الدامور بينصبوا لخطف المارة والمقايضة على أولادهم يلي كانوا ينخطفوا على إيد الفلسطينيين. مع بداية ال76 كانت الدامور هالبلدة المسيحية بموقعها الاستراتيجي على الطريق الساحلي يلي بيربط بيروت بالمخيمات الفلسطينية بالجنوب، محل ما تمركزت الميليشيات الفلسطينية لتقوم بعملياتها العسكرية ضد إسرائيل. بالتالي كان يعتبر هالطريق الساحلي معبر أساسي لنقل الأسلحة والمؤن بين بيروت والجنوب، وكان في حاجز للجيش اللبناني وحواجز تاني طيارة لأهالي الدامور بينصبوا لخطف المارة والمقايضة على أولادهم يلي كانوا ينخطفوا على إيد الفلسطينية ببيروت استفزازاً لأهل الدامور. هالحواجز صارت تشكل عائق لخط التموين الأساسي تبع الفلسطينية. كرمال هيك استغلوا أحداث مخيماتهم
للاجئين بالضبي والكارنتينا كحجة ليهاجموا الدمور، ولكن ما كان الهدف محصور بتحرير طريق الساحل على الجنوب، بس كان الهدف كمان تطويق المناطق المسيحية وتعطيل العلاقة المفترضة بين المسيحية اللبنانية والحكومة السورية. وكان هدف الميليشيات الفلسطينية توسيع سيطرتها على لبنان ليصير إلهم الوطن البديل يلي كانوا عم يسعوا إله. من ناحيتها دفعت السلطة السورية بشكل مباشر عملية الهجوم على الدمور، لأنهم اعتبروها فرصة لتقسيم لبنان وزيادة تأثيرهم على الحركة الوطنية المتحالفة مع المقاومة الفلسطينية، وعلى راسها كمال جنبلاط. لهالسبب أرسل النظام السوري قوات اليرموك والصاعقة، وهي الميليشيات الفلسطينية السورية، لينضموا للقوى الفلسطينية والحركة الوطنية بهجوم على الدمور يلي بدأ بتاريخ 16 كانون الثاني واستمر لعدة أيام.
مع بداية شهر كانون الثاني 1976 كانت القوات المسيحية الانعزالية من الجبهة اللبنانية عم تستكمل سياستها التقسيمية بهدف تهجير الأقليات المسلمة من المناطق المسيحية. لهالسبب وبتاريخ 4 كانون الثاني نفذت عملية تطويق تمويني لمخيم تل الزعتر الفلسطيني، وكرد فعل قررت القيادة العسكرية المشتركة للمقاومة الفلسطينية والحركة الوطنية إنه ترد بالمثل. وبتاريخ 5 كانون الثاني حاصروا بلدة الدمور لأن كانت تعتبر بلدة استراتيجية بتربط بيروت مع الجنوب المسلم الموالي للفلسطينية. وكانوا الأهالي بمحيط الدمور منزعجين ومستائين من حواجز الخطف والقتل والاغتصاب يلي راح فيها عدد كبير من الأبرياء اللبنانية والفلسطينية، ويلي كانت تحت إمرة أنطوان عرمان الملقب بمسؤول أمن الحدود. بتاريخ 14 كانون الثاني هاجم حوالي 3000 مسلح من الكتائب والأحرار ومغاوير حراس الأرز على مخيم الضبية المأهول من الفلسطينية المسيحية بالرغم أنهم كانوا على هامش النزاع، ودمروا المخيم وقتلوا سكانه بوحشية وكانوا يجرجرون بطريقة السحل بالسيارات. هالاعتداء على مخيم الضبي الفلسطيني اعتبر تحدي بيستوجب الرد لتلقين المسيحية درس قاسي. لهالسبب قررت القيادة العسكرية المشتركة للمقاومة الفلسطينية والحركة الوطنية بتصعيد عملية الهجوم على الدمور بتاريخ 16 كانون الثاني يلي استمرت عدة أيام.
بنص الليل هجم حوالي 3000 مسلح من الفلسطينيين الموالين لسوريا مع أعوانهم من الحركة الوطنية على الدمور من 3 محاور: بيروت، صيدا والجبل. أولاً بدأ الهجوم بقصف مدفعي كثيف من التلال المحيطة بالبلدة، رافقوا قصف بحري من الجهة الجنوبية والغربية. سقط ليلتها عدد بيتراوح بين 600 وال1000 قذيفة، لحقها تسلل ليلي من مزارع الموز والليمون، فاجأوا فيها أهالي البلدة وحرقوا البيوت وذبحوا حوالي 40 مدني هن ونايمين ببيوتهم، وأغلبهم من النساء والأطفال. تصدى الأهالي للهجوم بمساعدة عناصر من الكتايب ونمور الأحرار، وقتلوا بدورهم عدد من المسلحين. ولحوالي ساعات الظهر قدرت الميليشيات المسيحية المدافعة عن الدمور من إجبار المهاجمين على الخروج من البلدة من ناحية الجبل. وأثناء خروجهم هاجم الفلسطينية قافلة إمداد تابعة للجيش اللبناني بمنطقة الناعمة، يلي بدوره رد على هالتعدي وقصف قوات الفلسطينية بسلاح الجو الحربي. وتدخل بعض عناصر الجيش ليساعدوا أهالي الدمور ليهربوا من البلدة ويحتموا بقصر السعديات مقر زعيم الأحرار كميل شمعون يلي كان بوقتها كمان وزير الدفاع. وبالتالي الجيش ما شارك مباشرة بالمواجهات بين المتقاتلين بالدمور بسبب الخلافات السياسية الداخلية حول تورطه بالنزاع.
بلش الهجوم على الدمور بالليل مع قصف مركز على أحياء تجمع المسلحين ومرابض المدفعية. مع طلوع الفجر اقتحم حوالي 600 ل 700 مقاتل من القوى الفلسطينية والحركة الوطنية يلي بأغلبها من منظمة فتح بلدة الدمور من 3 محاور: من الشمال باتجاه الناعمة، من بعورتها شرقا، من الجنوب باتجاه الجية. أول ما فاتوا على الدمور اشتبكوا مع ميليشيا الجبهة اللبنانية بمعارك عنيفة استمرت لأول ساعات الصبح. بعد ما انتصرت على ميليشيات الجبهة اللبنانية دخلت قوات حركة فتح على الدمور مع تعليمات صارمة من قيادتها بعدم التعرض للمدنيين وخاصة العجزة والنساء والأطفال، وصاروا يوقفوا القصف بشكل متقطع ليعطوا مجال للأهالي إنه يهربوا على السعديات ويحتموا بقصر رئيس حزب الأحرار كميل شمعون، وامتنعوا كمان عن إطلاق النار على المراكب يلي هربت الناس بالبحر على بيروت. توغلت عناصر فتح بالدمور وبطريقة نسفت 4 بنايات كانت مراكز للمسلحين ومستودعات للأسلحة، وسقط خلال هالمعارك حوالي 20 شخص بين قتيل وجريح، وانتهت بتطهير مركزين للكتائب والأحرار. دخل الجيش اللبناني ليوقف تقدم القوات المشتركة، وبعد ما استطلع على المنطقة بطيارات سلاح الجو عند ساعات الظهر قصف مواقع القوات المشتركة بمحيط الدمور، وبدوره تعرضت فرق الجيش لقصف من دفاعات مضادة للطيران من طراز الدوشكا، وسقطت منها طيارة ميراج وطيارة هليكوبتر. بعد الظهر بعت الجيش سفينة حربية نزلت زوارق من عناصر الجيش، تسللوا على الدمور من بساتين الموز والليمون وتمركزوا غرب الدمور ليقصفوا على القوات المشتركة. صوب المساء قدر الجيش يفرض على القوات المشتركة تتراجع وتترك بعض مواقعها قبل ما تنقطع خطوط التواصل والتموين بين المقاتلين والتعزيزات يلي كانت تجيهم من خارج الدمور.
تاني يوم بتاريخ 17 كانون الثاني خف الضغط على جبهة الدمور وانتقل القتال لمنطقة الجية والسعديات جنوبا. حاصرت القوات المشتركة الرئيس شمعون بالسعديات مع 8000 نازح من أهالي الجية والدمور والمنطقة المحيطة، أغلبهم أطفال ونساء وشيوخ. بعد ما تعرض القصر للقصف سهل الرئيس شمعون عملية إجلاء الأهالي عبر البحر لجوني والكسليك بمساعدة قوارب البحرية اللبنانية التابعة للجيش وبعض الزوارق المدنية، مع استمرار القصف المباشر على النازحين من قبل القوات الفلسطينية. استمرت عمليات النزوح لتاريخ 19 كانون الثاني لما اجت عناصر من الجيش اللبناني لتحذر الأهالي من جولة هجوم تاني للفلسطينية على الدمور. بوقتها انتقل عدد من النساء والأطفال والعجزة ليحتموا بكنايس الدمور، كنيسة سيدة السلام وكنيسة مار الياس الحي، والبقية قدروا يوصلوا على السعديات على أمل الهروب عبر البحر. بتاريخ 20 كانون الثاني استولت الميليشيات الفلسطينية على الدمور، وكان باقي فيها حوالي 350 شخص مدني وتقريبا 20 عنصر من القوات المسيحية المدافعة. وهالمسلحين الغرباء أعدموا العناصر المسلحة ووقفوا المدنيين على الحيطان ووصوهم. أما النساء فاغتصبوا جماعيا والأطفال انذبحوا، وبالآخر حرقت القوات المشتركة بيوت الدوامرة. أما يلي كان مخبى بكنيسة سيدة السلام فتمت تصفيتهم، مع أنه كانوا استسلموا وعلقوا علم أبيض على باب الكنيسة. والنساء والأطفال بكنيسة مار الياس يلي كانوا عم بيصلوا على صوت عالي لما يسمعوا شو عم بيصير برا قدروا يهربوا على السعديات بمساعدة آخر 2 من عناصر الجيش اللبناني. انسرقت البيوت وبقيت الجثث مرمية بالشوارع لعدة أيام، وحتى أنه تم فتح القبور وانتشلوا الجثث من المدافن ونكلوا فيها. حصيلة القتلى نتيجة مجزرة الدمور كانت 149 قتيل، والحصيلة العامة بين الدمور ومحيطها بين 350 وال400 ضحية.
تاني يوم بتاريخ 17 كانون الثاني رجعت جددت القوات المشتركة الهجوم على قوات الجبهة اللبنانية بدعم عسكري كبير، ومن بعد ليل عنيف سقط فيه حوالي 2000 قذيفة على المنطقة قدرت تسيطر على جزء كبير من الدمور. تاني يوم هجمت ميليشيا الجبهة اللبنانية على المسلخ الكارنتينا بشكل وحشي، سقط فيه حوالي 1000 قتيل وانمسح المخيم بالكامل، ويلي خلصوا هربوا على مخيمات تانية. بعض المصادر بتقول انه بيير الجميل والرئيس شمعون شربوا الشامبانيا احتفالا بهالانتصار. وكرد فعل على هالأعمال الوحشية هجمت القوات المشتركة وفتح بمقدمتها واستولت نهائيا وبشكل كامل على الدمور والسعديات معقل الرئيس شمعون وقصفت مخزن للذخيرة بجنب قصر السعديات قبل ما يسقط بتاريخ 20 كانون الثاني. اتدخلت شخصيات كبيرة صديقة للمقاومة مثل كمال جنبلاط وصائب سلام لحماية شمعون، يلي ساعد أبو عمار شخصياً بإخراجه من القصر بطيارة هليكوبتر قبل ما تحتله القوات المشتركة. رغم التعليمات الواضحة والصارمة بعدم الخروج عن قواعد القتال الاحترافي ونطاق العمل العسكري يلي بالفعل صار بأول أيام عملية الهجوم على الدامور، خرجت الأمور عن السيطرة باليوم الرابع بعد دخول ميليشيات من الحركة الوطنية وقامت بأعمال تصفية ونهب كبيرة وهمجية بالدامور. وبآخرتها اجت مجموعات من الفلاحين الجنوبيين الغضبانين وسرقوا قصر السعديات ودمروه. وبيقولوا انه شمعون اكتر شي زعل على سرقة لوحة المرحومة زوجته، فقام ياسر عرفات بفتح تحقيق وقدر يسترجع اللوحة بوقتها بمقابل 5000 ليرة لبنانية. How many of you feel sadness? Can you show me your hand? Any of you feel anger? How many of you are experiencing feeling of fear? Were some of you leaning more towards the national movement narrative, the one with my voice? Any of you leaned more towards the Lebanese Front narrative, the one with Shadin's voice? I'd like to hear from some of you who leaned towards the Lebanese Front narrative. How does the other narrative make you feel? How did it make you feel? Maybe if one or two would like to share, I'll bring them my microphone.
Thank you. I felt that the point of view that was shared with your voice was like theoretical and how things should be in a perfect way, but not. It is not realistic. That's what I felt.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to share briefly?
Actually, the second version with your voice, I'm among people who lived that period. And we were so much frustrated to read these informations in the, what we called by that time, the opposite newspapers, etc., like Safir or others. And actually, I was among people who were receiving these refugees coming from Damour. I mean, Damour people who came by the sea. And it was very easy to understand the truth or to know the truth. Because when you listen to miscellaneous testimonies, you can compare if anyone was exaggerating or, you know, when he's afraid he can imagine things. No. So the other version was really, really out of scope or contrary to the truth. So actually, even the version with your voice, they say it was out of control. So they were giving excuses to these atrocities they've done.
Thank you. let me ask another question. If you had been one of the leaders of the leftist national movement in 1975, 1976, with what you know today, in what way would you have influenced the decision of your movement, especially after the attacks of Tell el-Za'atar and the Dbayi camps, which the national movement considered to have been enough motivation to respond with violence in Damour? Imagine yourself in a leadership position in the national movement. What would you have said or done that could have influenced the decision differently? Again, if one or two would like to contribute to that. Nobody dares.
I'm going to speak in Arabic, can I? Or in French if you want. أنا شخصياً عشت كل هالمرحلة وعشت مرحلة تل الزعتر.
I lived that phase, and I lived the phase of Tell el-Za'atar.
Okay. تل الزعتر اجت نتيجة قصف المناطق اللي كانت تتسمى المسيحية.
Tell el-Za'atar massacre was the result of the bombing of areas that were considered East Beirut, Christian.
Okay. وكانوا يوقفوا الشباب على طلعة مكلس لبرمانة والمسيحي يا يفوتوا على الكام يحبسوه يا يقوصوه دغري ويرجعوه شقف عند أهله.
So the leftists would set up checkpoints and stop Christians that were going up to Brahmana, and if they were Christians, they would either kill them or kidnap them.
So ما بنقدر نقول إنه تل الزعتر تل الزعتر اجت نتيجة تصرف المسيحيين، لا اجت نتيجة تصرف القوى الوطنية بهديك الوقت.
So we have to say that the Tell el-Za'atar massacre were the result not of Christian behavior but of the Palestinian behavior at the time.
تخفف الضغط عن المناطق التي كانت تسمى بالمناطق المسيحية الشرقية.
In order to relieve the pressure that was applied on the so-called Christian regions.
أعطيكم بعدين تفاصيل عن تل الزعتر لأنه عشت كل هالمرحلة، بس كانت كتير صعبة على الكل. شفت بعيني فلسطينيين عم يزحلون على الطريق، وبعرف إنه كان في مسيحيين عم ينزحلوا على الطريق كمان.
I lived the Tell el-Za'atar period. It was very difficult. I could give more details, but I saw Christians and Palestinians being dragged behind cars on the roads on both sides.
So كنا عايشين مرحلة violence بكل معناه.
So we were living the spirit of violence in all of its ugly meaning.
وقت نفوت بدوامة العنف ما بقى بتعرف مين معه حق ومين ما معه حق.
When you enter the cycle of violence, you don't know anymore who's right and who's wrong. Can I ask you a question, Naji? What would you like to say to the combatants and decision makers of that period?
Now, think at all. They did have to do at this time. بدي أخبرك خبرية صغيرة. وقتها قلعوا بمعركة تل الزعتر بلشوا الشباب ما كان عندهم معدات، ما كان في كان في كاميونات تنزلون على المعركة، على أرض المعركة.
When the Tal Zatar events began, the Christian militias didn't have any weaponry. There were trucks that would drop them off at the battlefield.
أنا شخصياً كنت أهتم بالطعام تبع المتطوعين.
I was involved in providing food to the volunteers.
بقى تاني يوم أو تالت يوم الصبح بكير بظهر لبرا بشوف شاب عمره شي 17-18 سنة.
On the second or third day, I went out early and I saw a young man who was 17 or 18 years old.
كنت عم بشرب فنجان قهوة.
I was having my cup of coffee.
بيطلع فيه بيقول لي أستاذ
He looked at me and said, "Sir,
تقدر تعطيني فنجان قهوة بركي يكون الأخير.
can you give me a cup of coffee? It might be my last."
وطلع فعلا آخر فنجان قهوة شربه لأنه نزل على المعركة وقتل فورا.
And it was the last cup of coffee. He
وهيدي
went to the
الصور
battlefield and stayed there.
هالصورة وغيرها بيضلون يمرقوا براسي كل الوقت. يعني إذا بتحكوا عن التروماتيزم، صح، تروماتيزم دائم. يعني مثل ما صار في مثلا مرة انفجار قدام بيتي بالحزمية، بقدر أكد لك إنه كل يومين بحس في شيء عم ينفجر براسي. أنا وعايش حياة طبيعية مثل اللي عم ياخد دراجز وعم ترجع الروتور دو دراج. إذا بتعرف شو الروتور دو دراج، بترجع هالدراج براسه دايما.
So we are indeed living trauma. There was an explosion that took place next to my house in Hazmiye, and every couple of days, I feel the same. I experience the same type of trauma, even though I continue to live my life. It's like getting out, trying to quit drugs.
الشغل اللي عم تعملوه كتير مهم لنقدر نرجع نردد براسنا كل هالقصص ونجرب نتجاوزها بعد ما تجاوزناها بعد بكير.
Thank you. I would like to go back to the question. If you had the opportunity, what would you say to the combatants and decision makers? You don't have to have experienced the Civil War to have something to say. What do the two narratives that you watched make you feel like saying to combatants? Sorry? Stop at once. Okay, anybody else?
The Palestinians aren't worth it. Stop the game. Lebanon is losing. Everyone else is winning. That's what I would say.
Okay. So the Palestinian issue is not worth destroying Lebanon?
Yes. And everyone else is winning on all the conflicts. The Arabs, the Israelis, the Americans, the Soviets. So,
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Anyone else would have something to say to combatants or decision makers?
I would tell them their own children to battle.
Which elements do you think of the mentality that you saw displayed in the movie, which elements of this mentality are still with us who live on the Lebanese geographical plot?
I think the Lebanese people are very immature. I think they're slaves of world powers, they're mercenaries. And I think this is something that even before Taif politics, it starts from a young age when your parents tell you, even within your own school. Don't share your notes with your friends. So I think, unfortunately, Lebanese people are violent by nature. They're aggressive by nature. They're hateful by nature. So I'll tell the Lebanese people, no, guys, we're losing. The world is making fun of us. We are the garbage dump of the Mediterranean. The International Mediterranean Organization annually releases garbage bags coming from Lebanon to Italy and Spain. So I would tell the Lebanese people, guys, stop being hateful. We're losing. We're the joke of the Mediterranean. We're the joke of the world. We are a case study of what not to be. So that's what like. We still have the hate, even before Taifa. It's with your own brother, with your own classmate, when you're driving the car and you want to pull the gun and shoot someone. So we're people of hate, unfortunately. We don't have love.
Sobering. Thank you for sharing this. Any other ills you see in the Lebanese people today that was already displayed there?
I see that even today Lebanese want to win. It's like one Lebanese wants to win over the other. It's still strong.
Maybe 2 closing thoughts.
Earlier in the discussion, it was mentioned that one way to change what's happening is to take the narrative from a war to a political one. And I think that that's exactly what's the issue at hand, that people did not have the time to heal from their scars, and that rather had to still continue fighting, but rather than a direct fight, a shadow of a fight.
Thank you so much. And the final word?
Yes, I think that unfortunately we still share that Lebanon is a space for conflict, for regional conflict between different countries, even though Lebanon is not all Lebanese or the Lebanon state is agreeing on conflict. So even though the formal opinion or decision is not to be into conflict, conflict is still part of the country.
Thank you. Actually, I do have to wrap up.
Thank you. The video that we saw creates a dilemma for me because it tears me apart. It crucifies me between, on the one hand, wanting to hear the multiple narratives, because I believe these multiple narratives could be a healing thing or a therapeutic thing for us. But in hearing these multiple narratives, I fear, and this is where I'm stretched from the other side, that the question of truth gets swapped. Who was right and who was wrong? And I'm sure the question of right and wrong is so important in all of this, to bring it out. And you're torn between these two poles, you know. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do.
Do you have anything to say, Shadan? What should Dr. Johnny do?
Not my words, but after we develop these narratives, we do some focus groups to discuss, to showcase what we have, and to ask those present what would be their opinion. And actually, one person, he was a young man, when he saw these two narratives, he was silent through the whole time. 2 hours. So he was sitting silent. I thought he was disengaged from the conversation. But before we were wrapping up, the last 10 minutes, he said, and this guy belonged or had an affiliation with a political party. He said that if we have 2 narratives, that means either one is not saying the truth. If I can't understand them with the history, if I can't trust them with giving me correct history, then I can't trust them on the future. So each has his own version of what happened, but that brings us to also us reflect what is history and what is historiography and how can we deal with the past. It is the space to discuss and to think. So that is the question from the focus group, not mine. If you have another.
We're going to wrap this session. I apologize for those who weren't able to say everything they wanted, because, but we have to limit ourselves in time, and I hope we can continue to discuss outside. What I want to say is that in our focus group testing that we did, we intentionally did different kinds of focus groups. Some of the focus groups were between the ages of 18 and 35. Other focus groups were between 35 and 50, and others were over 50. And we were able to witness how different age categories remember differently. Those who have experienced it, respond with their gut. I think maybe we saw some examples of this, because it brings back memories that are very painful, and that's normal and that's necessary, and that maybe is a bit cathartic. Other category is less personally touched, but remembers maybe the ends of the war and realizes the difficult decisions their parents had to make. And then we saw something which I always felt were quite encouraging, which is that those under 35 were very engaged, but in a more detached way. Anger was often one of the emotions felt. And when some of the over 50s, like me, wanted to say, it's not helpful, let's not bring all of this trash back out, the under 35 were saying, no, we can handle it. So the over 50 were worried that those under 35 couldn't handle it. The under 35 were saying, we want to remember, and we can handle it. And actually the feeling of disgust and anger was a very constructive and I think a very good set of emotions if we want to build a better future in Lebanon. I'm going to leave you with this. To be honest, Shadin and I have not figured out everything about what to do with this. We're producing modules, tools. We're currently working on another project in collaboration with the Lebanese Association for History in order to turn some of these modules into for school curricula and use them as tools in the curricula to teach Lebanon's history. So we're discovering, it's a work of archaeology. We don't have the whole picture yet. We have a few artifacts. And I want to thank you for being such good participants tonight. I'm going to hand the microphone back to my colleague, Dr. Awad.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, Shadin. Thank you, Dr. Awad. Everybody is invited for some refreshments and some snacks, so please help yourself, and thank you for coming. We will see you hopefully in the next lecture, which 20th of March? 20th of March. Watch your emails. See you later.